that people in their area see a whole heck of a lot, but maybe they're seeing more now because of certain, ecological reasons, then it's real easy for those things to be misidentified. And, when your brain's trying to fill in details of something like, yeah, and it's completely unexpected, it can make a black bear Bigfoot. It can make a great blue heron Mothman. Who knows? And that's something else that we have to look for. Those of us, I think, who know what we're doing, it's usually pretty easy to discern, I think, when that's happening on camera. Probably the most difficult part of those situations, at least in my experience, can be, convincing someone that the evidence that they think that they had captured, is evidence of something completely different. Honestly, in this gentleman's case that I was just referencing, great guy. As soon as I started explaining it to him, one of the first things I did was just ask him to look at it. He didn't say what kind. I just said, why don't you go through some images of large birds, like large migratory birds, like cranes and herons and stuff, and tell me if any of them look remotely similar to what you saw. And kind of from there, I managed to talk to him for a bit after that. And this is over the course of several conversations, of course. And so, I had managed to talk to him for a bit, after that. And he was a very reasonable guy. So we did eventually get to a place where, he was just sort of like, wow, I was sure I saw something crazy. But now in hindsight, with, the evidence that we have, the video doesn't lie. It must have been, a large migratory bird, probably a great blue heron. But at the time, it sure seemed weird. So yeah, it's, there's a lot of difficulties in examining people's evidence, I think. I mean, I don't know. I feel like we've sort of hit the high points of that,
Oh yeah. But have you ever had a case where you couldn't debunk it, where you checked everything out and it just kind of like you were scratching your head afterwards, like, oh,
sure.
Yeah, and
a lot of them are like that.
Yeah, sometimes it makes you wonder at that point, maybe they saw what they saw. And, again, the forest system, there is areas in our forest where, humans probably haven't even taken a step or even been into, so remote. The same way, like, things wash up out of the ocean that we don't even knew, or we don't even expect that existed. We thought they died off 1 million years ago, and all of a sudden some creature, wash up. And it shocks the scientists. So, I mean, there's things out there I just don't know. I just don't, like Mothman. I had somebody the other night talking about it in Pennsylvania. They claim that there are Mothmen there. But again, I think too, because of our earth changes, our weather changes, the patterns and stuff.
Sure.
I think a lot of animals and creatures are, they're changing their habits. They're changing their locations where they live. And I always wonder, when they log out an area, like where all the deer and all the bear and all the whatever, where do they go?
They get pushed somewhere.
Yeah.
I mean, they have to be. I should clarify, certainly not all of my cases are so easily, explained. That really was just one example of one where I had some evidence, and they would look at it, and it turned out to be something totally mundane. Plenty of the Lake Michigan Mothman sightings are completely unexplained. I have no rational explanation for them. Most of the historical and recent, flying humanoid Mothman like sightings that I've received from Rockford, I have no good explanation for. At a certain point in this field, very often, you're sort of left in this precarious position where, you know, if you believe the witness's story, and so often I have no reason not to. You know, I don't think people are lying to me. I've caught people in lies before. After, you know, a certain point, you've got a pretty good feel for it. And if you can verify all of their other details, there's just no reason to believe people are lying to your face. And so at that point, you are left in this position where if what they're saying is true, and again, I have no reason to believe that it's not, there's no rational explanation from like a scientific materialist paradigm, you know, like there's no rational explanation for what they experience. And so, yeah, at that point, you know, you've got to ask yourself, like, what's out there? You know, what did they see? And yeah, I just don't know, you know, sometimes I think that we're slowly getting a better idea. You know, actually, I think a lot of the stuff we talked about tonight, Gary, kind of gets at the heart of most of these phenomena. You know, I think that once you really start talking about things like, you know, interdimensionality and parallel universe and portals and things like that, that you not to, well, not, no pun intended, but you open a lot of doors, you know, at that point. And suddenly a lot of this stuff, I don't know if it necessarily makes more sense in that, you know, we have a greater understanding of its nature, but it certainly seems more possible, at least from the angle of being able to explain how something like it could have potentially happened. You know, like I don't think that there is any ecological way for something like a Mothman to just live around Lake Michigan, and just hang out there like any other species and not be very, very, very well known. But, you know, once you start to consider things, you know, like parallel universes or the idea that a being could be, you know, of, say, a higher dimension than our three-dimensional selves, and thus would interact with our environment in ways that would seem impossible to us. You know, like once you start considering possibilities like that, then all of a sudden, yeah, I mean, why not Mothman? Sure, maybe. You know, if it could just seemingly blink in and out of existence, you know, on a whim, and you know, essentially do things that, you know, we would consider impossible, sure. I mean, at that point, anything can happen. So who knows?
Well, you know, maybe originally there was a Mothman and people saw it, and again, maybe it came through a portal and left, you know, through a portal. But then that's where these stories start, you know, growing and growing. You know, it's just, you know, I hear those type of things all the time about myths of, you know, like hitchhikers or little people or Bigfoot or all these other little things, you know, like elves and stuff like that. And, you know, people want to believe in something. So I guess, too, when you got a world that's so upside down on a regular basis and people sometimes are not the happiest in their own world, I guess it gives them something to, you know, to believe in.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably part of it. You know, I don't know how much that affect. Well, I mean, the objective experience itself is the objective experience. But you're absolutely right. Like, there are a number of narratives that I see people apply to things that, you know, don't really have much to do with the actual experience itself, you know. So, I'll have people who will say have a reported sighting of a shadow person, right? And they will, for no good reason that I can think of, other than basically exactly what you're talking about, which is, because they find it comforting, will have decided that the shadow person that they saw was like their deceased grandmother coming back to visit them, for instance, So at that point, I believe that they saw this shadow person, but I think that it's, extremely premature for them to be saying something like, oh, it must have been my deceased grandmother coming back to pay me a visit, just because that's the most comforting narrative that they could think of at that time. Certainly we don't know that to be true. I don't think anybody, even attempting rationality would jump to that conclusion for some reason. So, yeah, it definitely serves to muddy the waters quite a bit, unfortunately. And going back to one of your earlier points, I think that part of what that does too is it can kind of take away some of the credibility. I think if people did their best to simply report the experience without, tacking on any additional narrative, then that would go a long way towards, I think people taking these things more seriously, because the difference between I saw a weird humanoid, shadow that I can't explain, and, my deceased loved one showed up in my house, is that, one of those is an experience, and the other one is, it's a narrative that you have really no evidence for. And nobody should misunderstand me. I'm not saying that it is impossible for any deceased loved one to come back and visit someone. That is not what I'm saying. I'm just saying we shouldn't assume we shouldn't assume that's the case. We shouldn't assume anything's the case that we don't necessarily have any evidence for in a particular situation. So, if that shadow person had come back with a tray of cookies and wearing their grandmother's apron, that would be a different story.
Yeah, with a hot milk to go with it.
Right.
But I gotta
Exactly.
say, I gotta say this. My aunt, my grandmother Sally, when I was a kid, I grew up in Seattle, but I would get farmed off when I was a young kid. I'm probably 5 years old to like 13 when I got old enough to tell my dad no. I would get farmed out to up in Oakland, California every summer for like 2 months. And I would spend some time with my grandmother and then the rest with my uncle and his like 5 or 6 brats. And I call them brats, or they were. Anyway, but, my grandmother lived in an old, and this is, like I'm 67, so you can figure out that was like 60 some years ago, 62 years ago. I remember she was in an old apartment. It was probably built before 1900. It was old, even then, So I remember the bedroom had a glass door on it, and it was kind of large. And she had a big walk-in closet. And she made me sleep in that room. And now maybe it was my imagination. I don't know. Maybe I had a really good, scary dream. But I remember sitting in the bed, and I always had to have a nightlight on. So the light was on in the closet because, I was scared of the boogeyman. I saw a shadow come out, and go around the whole room and then go back into the closet. Now, I can't say it was a human or what type of shadow it was, but I just noticed this shadow going, slowly down the walls and going all around the room and then going back in. It scared me so bad that I stayed all night under the blankets. Like, that's going to protect me,
Sure. Yeah, honestly, I have to give you credit there. I think that's a pretty reasonably good job of describing the experience, like I absolutely believe that, you saw a weird shadow